To have this opportunity to take you on a whirlwind tour of the history of the ARNBC up to July of 2013. It all started in 1912 when the Graduate Nurses Association was formed. By 1918, it had been established as the body responsible for regulating registered nurses, and in 1935 took on the name change to become the Registered Nurses Association of BC through the Registered Nurses Act. Fast forwarding to the next very major structural change, in 1981, the Labour Relations Division of that organization became the BC Nurses Union. And again, fast forwarding to 2003, what was known as the Health Professions Amendment to BC legislation created the conditions to repeal the Nurses Registered Act and bring nursing into line with other professions under the Health Professions Act. And this was a new model for regulating the scope of practice for healthcare professionals in BC. On August 19th of 2005, nursing was brought under this new Health Professions Act, and the ARNBC was transformed into the College of Registered Nurses of British Columbia. Now, the duties and objects of a college under this legislation did include an aspect we've referred to as Object K, in which a college can exercise its powers to promote and enhance the ability of its registrants to respond and adapt to changes in practice environments, advances in technology, and other emerging issues. Now, this was read by CRNBC leadership and accepted by the membership that had had such faith in the ARNBC that pretty much the business of the organization would go on as usual. In fact, the mission of the CRNBC, as articulated in its annual report of that year, confirmed that the vision of the CRNBC was still excellence in nursing, and that among its core values was visible leadership on health and nursing issues. Its leadership ensured nurses that much of what the ARNBC did, the CRNBC continues to do. And beyond a few minor structural changes, nurses were not alerted to the massive devolution of activities that would begin to occur over the next few years. However, some of those activities that were discontinued included the regional chapters and professional practice groups. The monthly magazine was discontinued, and nurses stopped receiving membership cards. In fact, they weren't any longer called members, they were now simply registrants. The CRNBC also stopped voting at CNA on matters beyond regulation, meaning that the CNA could no longer present a unified voice across the country on any key policy matter. Within 5 years, the mandate, vision, and purpose of CRNBC had been completely rewritten to eliminate all matters of professional leadership and advocacy on issues affecting the public health and public policy. And because the CRNBC board had also reconfigured itself as a much smaller board, with very limited input from its registrants, nurses had no capacity to influence the course of these decisions. The final straw for many nurses was the decision by that board to withdraw completely from the CNA, and that was the point at which most RNs in BC truly began to understand the danger for the profession. Up until this point, they had not necessarily understood it, or if they understood it, they often believed that the CRNBC should still be capable of enacting these policy roles. So there was considerable confusion as to what was possible and what was being done and who was responsible for it. And because the union had had the opportunity during these very same years, because of the Olympics and no bargaining during those 4 years, the union had had the opportunity to repurpose its resources, and it had taken up some of the slack, but not all, and particularly the part that had to do with government influence in a way that a bargaining unit cannot. So when the economic downturn happened in 2008, and we were all facing tremendous amount of healthcare restructuring, we really had hit the circumstance for a perfect storm. We had no capacity for a formalized policy response. In 2007 and 8, as these initial CRNBC changes were noticed by some nurses, especially those in leadership community who might have backgrounds that allowed them to interpret the signals, various nurses began to get pretty worried. Conversations started to happen in small groups, and several nursing leaders met with the executive director of the CRNBC to try and better understand the CRNBC's position. For the most part, many still felt that this was a temporary overreaction by the CRNBC to government expectations, and that it would resolve itself over time. But it didn't. By early 2009, a small group began to recognize that the situation was getting urgent and that something needed to be done. But nobody really had the authority to do anything. This initial meeting of 3 fairly quickly broadened into a group of 5, which met several times, including meetings with the CRNBC executive director. And despite these meetings, it was still not entirely clear what was motivating the CRNBC to make the changes that it was making, whether they were absolutely necessary or discretionary, and whether they might voluntarily transfer some of those original assets to a separate organization should one develop to carry on the remaining professional activities. By summer, a larger meeting was held with about 20 key leaders. It asked a number of questions, trying to sort out what's the nature of the situation that we could deal with. And it considered that there essentially were really only 4 possible options. It actually eliminated the first 3 of those options as at all viable and began to think that the only answer was to start something new. So that it divided up the responsibilities in terms of fact-finding and consultation and began to move forward. As an outcome of that particular summer meeting, the RN Network of British Columbia was formed. A subgroup of that summer meeting created a transitional steering committee of 8 nursing leaders, all of whom had positional authority and experience and networks to bring to the situation, and all were prepared to take active leadership in this work. This group built up an email list of people that were wanting to be informed, and a history of all of that is still available through the ARNBC website as part of the archives. By May of 2010, the group was ready to bring BC nurses together to explain why it was necessary to establish a new organization. Its only mechanism for communicating with BC nurses at this point was through a Canadian Nurses Insert. And at that meeting, which had active participation in speaking by the BC government, the CNA, the CRNBC, and the BCNU, the steering committee announced the formation of the Registered Nurses of the Association of Registered Nurses of British Columbia. The initial board, the initial appointed board was named, and the work began. There were high hopes at that point for a negotiated agreement with the CRNBC to transfer some of these assets and reorganize the work so as to continue to have an association presence in the province. There was also an absolute commitment to finding a model that would preserve universal membership for BC nurses, the model we have had and enjoyed for almost a century. So when CRNBC announced a year later, in April of 2011, that it was withdrawing from the CNA, and that, in its opinion, there was no nursing group in BC ready to take on that jurisdictional membership, that was a serious blow. Fortunately, the CNA by this time was willing to take the unusual step of a temporary arrangement with us, including funding support. They did this in recognition of the urgency of the times, the need for nurses at this point in history to work towards system transformation. And by May 2012, the organization had its first official annual general meeting and its first elected board members. Rochelle Bard was also part of that board from the Canadian Nurses Association. After having almost lost its professional voice, the BC now had an active presence at the CNA Biennial Convention in Vancouver, and it was able to join with the nurses of the country to celebrate 100 years of organized nursing in the province. It brought 38 voting delegates, presenting a good percentage of the motions to that AGM. And the work continued with a strategic plan to really work toward consolidating engagement and partnership and sustainability. By June of 2013, the ARNBC had its first fully elected board and a formal ongoing relationship with the CRNBC that includes a funding model and universal membership. So in June of 2013, it's in very good hands, and that's where I will leave it off as the new board takes over. Thanks very much for listening.